Welcome to the ICC Pulse Podcast, the show where we get to come alongside you and members across the country to equip and encourage. I'm Beau Hansen, your host for Season 6, and before another word is said, I'd like to make a very public tip of the hat to Liz McDonald for having the vision to get this show started. Years back when I first became a member of ICC, I was looking for all the educational information I could get and was so excited to find this podcast. So Liz, I'm personally grateful for the foundation that you laid, and hopefully the seasons ahead only build on your great work. You're going to get to know me more as we get to do this show, but I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit of my story. I've spent most of my career as an entrepreneur. It wasn't until relatively recently that I actually entered local government and became the deputy building official for the City of Beaumont here in Texas, which is why I'm really excited about today's episode. We're going to be exploring U.S. federal grants for building code officials and the importance of federal grants in enforcing building safety and resilience in the U.S. And if you want to follow along as we're talking about this, go to iccsafe.org/federal resources. This may be old hat for some of you, but if you're anything like me, grants can be a little confusing and overwhelming at times. So hopefully after this episode, you feel not just encouraged, but equipped to begin accessing federal funding for your city. We have a couple of guests here who are going to be extremely helpful in not only understanding an overview of grants, but also have successfully secured federal funding for themselves. And be sure to stay with us till the end. There are a couple of Code Council resources designed to help us in this grant application process. All right, let's get into it. So as mentioned, today's episode is one that is wildly practical for me for a couple of reasons. I'm on staff here in Beaumont, Texas, and if you don't know, that's directly east of Houston towards Louisiana. So not only are we incredibly prone to hurricanes here, but it's also climate 2A, which for us code nerds means extremely hot and humid. But no matter where you're listening, we all have our own crazy weather that we're dealing with in our own respect. So I don't have to convince you that there is a need for more resilient building assemblies, but also more resilient code departments to come alongside these efforts. That's today's conversation. We have the opportunity right now to unlock billions in federal grants for the sake of moving forward in resiliency efforts. And I have the perfect guest to coach us through this process. Stella Carr is joining us today, and Stella is the project manager for the Energy and Resilience. There you go. It's in your title. Energy and Resilience team at the International Code Council. And I'm thrilled to have you as my first interview. Stella, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and excited to be the first guest of this season.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. As we get started, tell us about yourself. Tell us what you do. That title is quite the title. So tell us about it.
Sure. So I've been with the Code Council for about a year and a half now, at least at the time of this recording. And I previously worked in local government. I was a sustainability director for the town of Lexington, Massachusetts, and spent some time working in Chandler, Arizona, with the city manager's office while I was in grad school. So my background is in environmental sustainability as well as public administration. So I have my master's in public administration from Arizona State University, where I was a Marvin Andrews Fellow. And so I got to combine my passion for sustainability and resilience at the local level with that public administration and working in cities, towns, counties, and understanding the array of operations and things that go on at the local level. So because there's been an increase in attention to these issues and the important role that building codes play really in energy and resilience for our nation, there's been a lot of funding put towards that. And the Code Council recognized that as a priority for the country and a priority for our members. And that's why they created this position to help work with our members and work with the Code Council to take advantage of this historic opportunity.
I love it. So I would imagine you've worked with quite a few jurisdictions. How many have you worked with in your time with the Code Council?
Most of these programs that I promote with members and help them with just kicked off about a year ago. And so just in 2023, we supported at least 50 jurisdictions with grant applications.
Wow.
And that's just based on my more one-on-one or kind of direct tracking of who I've talked to. But there may be people who more passively interact with our resources, go to our website or catch a webinar of ours and choose to not necessarily seek more help, but that those resources reach them too. And we're not necessarily able to capture that. It's really been impressive with how much members have been responsive to wanting to learn more and take advantage of the resources that myself and others at the Code Council can provide to help them through these grant processes and making their communities viable applicants to receive those funds.
Do you know the number? And if you don't, it's okay. Do you know how much funding y'all have been able to secure just in the last year?
So I know how much the Code Council has been able to work on through grants, through our many subsidiaries and partners to bring training and other resources to communities, mainly through the RECI, or the Resilient and Efficient Codes Implementation Grant that DOE started last year. And through that, it's give or take $4 million that's directed to Code Council efforts like certifications and training, code development, things like that. But there are definitely millions more that we see going to our members and states through the BRIC funding. For example, pretty soon here, they'll be announcing the BRIC Awards for this last fiscal year. And there was a new program which they put out $2 million for each state territory, and they were eligible to use that funding specifically for building code projects. And I believe there was an application received from almost every state and or territory for that. And that means many states are going to be getting $2 million towards their building code efforts, and that passes down to the jurisdictions. And so we don't have the final, but it's been really well subscribed to that program. And so there literally millions of dollars going to building codes across the country.
And hopefully my jurisdiction soon. That's the hope.
Yeah.
So, hey, I want to hit pause for a moment, because for someone who's never dealt with federal grants before, what do we mean when we say federal grants in the context of supporting building and energy code projects? In other words, this is such a big conversation. Just hearing you talk about this, where does the rubber meet the road for small jurisdictions like my own?
So people in local governments are probably familiar with federal grants at the broad scheme. There's a lot of different ways that the federal government offers funding or aid to communities for various projects. And you're familiar with infrastructure projects. There was ARPA and other programs that started during COVID to help with that. And so every program is different. And similarly, with the grants that are available to help building codes or energy codes, most of them are coming from different departments, even different divisions of the federal government. So Department of Energy has several grants, and they're all through different divisions within Department of Energy, and FEMA has programs as well. And so there are a lot of different avenues that jurisdictions that manage building codes or energy codes could pursue receiving these funds. And what happens is when you apply for these grants, each one has different rules or sort of process for it. Right. But ultimately, you're going to be receiving funds that can help your community in a number of ways. For example, you could use the funding, depending on the program, to support training. So if you are adopting a new code in your community and you want to educate your officials and building community on those code provisions, you could bring training to your staff and community. You could encourage new certifications and education of members and use funds to cover those costs of training and building the workforce in your community as well.
Is there any sort of cadence to the annual federal funding process? In other words, should we begin in a particular season, or can you walk us through that process?
The grant cycles, like a lot of things in the world, are a cycle. So depending on the funding source, some of them are going to be consistent in that, it's a piece of legislation that this funding will happen every year. Maybe the amount of funding is different, but it is something that Congress has passed, and it's a consistent thing that's going to be happening. And others are based on more recent legislation that have a discrete amount of time and funding behind them. And so once those programs are through, that funding will run out, but there's still each year a new application cycle. typically speaking, the fall is when a lot of the programs open up. So that's when we see BRIC announced. And what you're going to be looking out for, and what we, encourage our members to stay in the know of, and we promote in our newsletter and website, etc. There's what we call a federal funding announcement, or a FOA, funding opportunity announcement, or a NOFO, notice of funding opportunity. And these are the official rules and process of what's being announced, many pages long, that say, here's what the grant is, here's what's eligible, here are the deadlines, etc. And those typically get released in the fall. Sometimes they're delayed, so it's not necessarily a specific date or month that we can count on, but usually a general time. And so around late summer, fall, we start to see some of these programs announced. And depending on the initiative, there's somewhat tight turnarounds with these applications. So when you do know something is going to be coming maybe 6 months down the line, it's never too soon to start getting yourself prepared to submit an application, because generally speaking, unless it's a new program or waiting to find out what the grant's going to be for, we know what happened last year, and we can assume at the baseline the conditions will be similar. So you can start to prepare what you're going to do for your project, what type of materials. Across most grants, there's some basic information you're going to need just to get started filling out paperwork, because at the end of the day, it is, the federal government. There is a lot of kind of T's to cross and I's to dot. And luckily now everything is online. But that being said, once you find out about the dates, there could be a month turnaround or a 2-month turnaround. And if you're trying to do a really large project with multiple stakeholders, it could take time to get something like that put together to submit and really think through the idea. So if there is something that you have in mind, it's never too soon to start laying those pieces together. Typically, what we tell people is that from when you submit an application till when you can start doing the work is about a year. It does take some patience and time to really get off the ground and be able to do it. But as I mentioned, some of these funding opportunities aren't guaranteed to be around 10 years down the line. Some of them have a short window of 5 years that this funding is available. And so if you don't get in there and secure the grant, it's not guaranteed that type of funding will happen again. It's up to Congress and future federal legislators.
Thanks, Stella. I want to bring you back a little bit later to talk about the different ways the Code Council is helping grant applicants. But first, let's hear some success stories. Paul Demers is first, but before we get into your story, Paul, tell me a little bit about yourself.
I've been a code enforcement officer for 25 plus years, and about 4 years ago, the state of Maine created a new position as the state building official. And when they did, they had a very limited budget, but with the intentions of providing training and education as part of our certification program for the state to help bring our code enforcement world into the correct century. In doing so, prior to my arrival, they had applied for a BRICS grant and were fortunate enough to receive it. And that BRICS grant was intended to provide our office with the training resources during COVID to provide some webinar settings that would help to get the word out to people without a face-to-face event. The BRICS grant that we got, our first one, was basically set up as 144 training opportunities or units of training that gave us essentially $750 per event to allow us to have 3 years worth of weekly trainings. It was a good program.
That's great. Had you applied for grants before?
I was familiar with grant applications and processes, and nothing was much more of a pain in your side than to work with grant applications and get all of the administration that goes along with it. Our first year, the grant offerings were significant. I mean, in the state of Maine, if somebody offers us $500,000 for 25 cents on a dollar, we're smart enough to take advantage of that if we can. And as things have gone on, the progress with grants usually is that you're competing against other entities, other communities. The BRICS grant has the beauty of non-competitive portions, and it has continually doubled to the point where it went from $500,000 the first year $1 million the second, and now $2 million for the past 2 years. Our second BRICS grant, we applied for the ability to update all of our exams and provide guidance documents as well as resource documents for people taking those exams and explaining why each of the codes fit into the family of codes and into the safe built environment. It's something for new code officials coming into the program to use as a tool or a resource, but the BRICS grant gave us that opportunity, substantial money to do that, because we're reworking some 15-year-old programs or exams. In my second grant, we applied for and got code commentaries, the IRC and the IBC, both volumes, 100 copies of each to provide to as many code offices that actually enforce our codes in Maine. So
wow,
they're all getting a set of 2 books, which is great. And in addition to those, we also recognize that the youth in our field does have a better handle on technology and isn't afraid of it like some of us are. And so we added in 30 seats of digital complete access so that code officers in all the remote communities that have access to the internet now can actually do code searching online on a tablet, on a cell phone, or in their offices. So that, along with our copies and our updated exams, really was a fantastic second BRICS grant. And that one's just kicking off as we speak. Another part of that grant was to do a homework project for the state of Maine and determine what are the real needs of our fire and codes offices throughout the state. So through our university system, they're developing a questionnaire that's going to go to all 420 plus communities in the state that's going to be answered by code officials, answered by town managers, which is going to be an interesting result, and fire officials, and compare the notes on what all of these folks doing. And that part of the grant was substantial, but it's a study that's going to be the way we can better tailor our long-term results and focus the limited dollars the state of Maine has to the maximum benefit.
You talked about just how helpful the administrative side of things were walking through this process and the frustrations that were ultimately resolved in that. What about customer support? Did you ever have to pick up the phone and talk to a human being and get their help through the whole process?
Yes, absolutely. Had to, or even without having to, had the benefit of running into Stella Carr. Stella has been the best resource that I've had around to get to finding what direction to focus my grant application process. And she's been there working with outside agencies beyond just ICC or the state of Maine. She found sister organizations, some counterparts in crime, if you will, to provide some potential grants that would help more than just the Maine code officials.
When you think back on your extensive career knowledge, what role have grants played and how impactful have they been in your career?
In the old days, you had community development block grants. Those grants would come in and actually do a facelift on a neighborhood and try to bring some of the neighborhoods up to a safer and more pleasant appearance. All of those came with challenges and nothing of the magnitude of what this BRICS grant program has offered that is non-competitive. If you've got good projects, you don't lose. You can't.
My next guest, Clayton Trevelyan, will probably agree with that. Clayton's the chief building official for the incredibly fast-growing Tucson, Arizona. So Clayton, you're applying for a $3.5 million Recce grant. Talk to me about that and what you're hoping to put it towards.
Let me take one step back and just say the greatest expense of any building department is staffing. We are a service industry with consideration of the cost to operate a building department. Grants help provide a supplement funding stream to do the work that is so critical for us. It's challenging enough to justify getting new building inspectors or new plans examiners. And that's a shortage that I believe many building departments are struggling with today. But then when you challenge the norm and say, hey, we want to fund researchers and we want to fund community outreach programs that aim to shift how we apply the building codes, that's a whole nother ask. So grant funding for the city of Tucson is essential at bringing in qualified staff to help us really look at the long-term vision and see what we can do to shift the needle.
I got to imagine that application process is a bit daunting, especially at the size that you are going after. Have there been times where you're looking at this beast of an application process and just feeling how overwhelming it can be?
You hit the nail on the head. I'm not going to lie. There were some very long days in there, especially right out the gate, because the application opened with a very short window. So we were on crunch time right out of starting gate. And I have to give credit. The lion's share of that application preparation went to Leslie Ethan. She just did an amazing job at bringing folks together. I can't say enough good things about her and her dedication, personal resiliency, really, to see this thing through. And right below that, I got to put Stella, because whether we're talking about trying to understand the language of the grant or trying to connect with other folks, Stella has really just been stellar. I can't say it much any other way. The first step is really pouring through the criteria to qualify for the grant, making sure that every detail of the funding opportunity announcement, or FOA, is considered is absolutely critical to successfully funding a project. And once that FOA is available, we have to have some dedicated brain power to align our department goals with the parameters of those grants. And there again, Stella is key to our success, because her experience and knowledge is absolutely invaluable to understanding the nuances of how to get that application in, how to word it in such a way that we're meeting the intent of the grant funding opportunity while still achieving our department's objectives. One of the great benefits of teaming up with ICC is the resource circle available to Stella and all of the ICC team is much, much bigger than we have access to on our own. So getting in touch with the right people or the right group of people, just think about the quantity of experts that are associated with the building codes, and you scratch the surface of the resources available to ICC. Having that in our pocket is tremendously helpful to preparing some of these documents as we start to look at how these goals would be accomplished long term and what that really means to the community. One of the roadblocks that we came up with right from the beginning was the need for a state partner in this process. We had a room full of building officials and sustainability professionals really brainstorming at the very beginning of this. And we're sitting around with all kinds of Post-it notes and markers and whiteboards, and we're brainstorming and trying to come up with ways that we can really have an impact on our community. And then we start looking through the requirements of the grant and find out that we need a state partner. That was a challenge for us because at the time, the state of Arizona did not have an Office of Energy. We don't have state applied building codes. We're a home rule state. The work of gathering the different municipalities together was a big enough task. But then, what do we do for a state partner? Here again is where understanding the grant limitations is key, and having folks like Stella and other grant writing professionals available to say, hey, look, did you see this? Or did you realize that there's no restriction on which state is a partner? And so that's actually exactly what we did for this grant. We incorporated a New Mexico state partner. So we've got, in addition to major municipalities like Phoenix and Tucson, we also have Albuquerque and other cities in New Mexico as part of this partnership. And we opted to use a New Mexico state partner to fulfill that criteria of the grant.
That's good stuff. Clayton, how many years ago did you get involved in, you said you went to the public sector when?
I started with the City of Tucson in 2005, and I was in the private sector before that in the construction industry. So yeah, I'm at 19 years now in the public sector. And talking about the size or scope of this grant, this is the biggest grant that I've worked on. It's difficult not to feel overwhelmed when you look at a project scope this large with this much funding and these many partners. So having the stability of folks like Stella and others to help us kind of rein in those fears and also bring some reality back to the project is key to our success.
That's good stuff. Clayton, thanks so much. You know, stories like Clayton and Paul's are music to the ear of our next guest. But before we get to him, let's hear from today's sponsor, 4Leaf.
4Leaf, a proud sponsor of the International Code Council, is pleased to announce its full-service Code Enforcement Division. 4Leaf code officers have expertise in developing and providing standard operating procedures, staffing solutions, program development and analysis, community outreach, and they're known nationally for providing training for new and existing staff on a variety of code enforcement topics. If you're looking to join a fast-growing and dynamic organization, please visit at 4leafinc.com or email careers@4leafinc.com. That's 4leafinc.com for more information. 4Leaf, building partnerships since 1999.
Welcome back to the ICC Pulse Podcast. Our next guest is Gabe Mazer. Gabe is, big title here, Senior Vice President of Government Relations and National Strategy for the Code Council. If the title sounds big, so is the job. He manages and directs our federal and national policy and legislative priorities and maintains and enhances the Code Council's advocacy presence in Washington, D.C. That's a lot of ands. Welcome to the show, Gabe. So glad to have you.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about grants and everything that the Code Council, government relations team, and our broader community and member engagement are working on to support our profession.
Absolutely. And with what you do and where you're located, I feel like we could dedicate an entire episode to you just telling campfire stories about the things you've seen and experienced. But if you would, give us a summary. What are some emerging trends you've seen in the building safety industry lately?
There's been a number of research studies that have come out, big studies from the National Institute of Building Sciences, which found that building codes provide $11 in mitigation savings for every dollar invested. And then FEMA does this multi-year national story that finds that current code can avoid $600 billion in losses avoided from natural disasters. And there's this culmination of this research at a time when natural hazards are increasing in frequency and severity. Governments at all levels are recognizing this and reorienting their focus to ensure that a greater emphasis is spent mitigating against these growing risks as opposed to reacting to them after the fact and building back the same way that we did before. And with that research, building codes are increasingly viewed as one of, if not the most effective mitigation measures that a community can undertake. And so we've seen this increased attention to our world. And with that has been significant injection of federal resources. And alongside that is this growing incentivization for other dollars, big infrastructure dollars. But to see those big infrastructure dollars, the federal government's increasingly saying, you're going to be more competitive for these dollars if you've adopted local codes, because that way we know that these investments are well made, they're going to be built to last. So that's one big component. Another big one is the modernization or the digitization of the building safety space. And these grants that we're seeing can be also used for those purposes. So for modernizing building departments, and that means online codes and standards. It's the use of digital codes. It's the use of electronic plan review. It's the use of software that can facilitate remote virtual inspections. Not only does that provide better departmental resiliency, but it also speeds the transactional process with builders and with the public, right, and can greatly sort of assist building departments and their perception as being a partner in the development process as opposed to a sort of hoop to jump through. And so that's another trend that these grants are supporting. And the last one is an increased focus on sustainability. In the same way that building codes for resiliency have been recognized as one of the most powerful tools to see communities become more resilient to natural disasters, the same is true with building codes that conserve energy or conserve water. Building codes are one of the most powerful policy levers around. They affect all new construction, every sort of major retrofit affecting this given system. So there's a lot of money out there now encouraging codes that promote greater energy conservation and start to incorporate some of these additional systems, being ready to incorporate rooftop solar or energy storage and things like that. And there's also, and this is maybe a little bit more down the road, but looking into the sustainability of building materials.
So federal grants are the things driving a lot of, again, what you're hoping to see at such a high level. And so having local municipalities buy into that is absolutely key. One concern I have just hearing you talk about that, again, I'm in Southeast Texas, which is an incredibly hurricane-prone region. And a lot of times when a natural disaster rolls in, the local jurisdictions, man, we're making quick decisions on the fly. And we're certainly not throwing code out the window, but we are making decisions locally and as expeditiously as possible. And when federal dollars are involved in that, do you foresee any hamstringing of local jurisdictions? Is there anything to be concerned about in that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there's balance of sort of, incentivization, which is the goal of a lot of these grant programs. The grants that we've worked on, on the FEMA side are pretty flexible in that regard. I think FEMA, in terms of adopted codes, FEMA does have opinions on the parts of the code that protect against hazards. So if FEMA is going to support a grant and maybe the grants to update codes, they may have concerns about if you're in a hurricane-prone region, weakening the wind load provisions, for example. But when it comes to implementation, they're focused on big picture. We want to support a well-staffed, trained up building department that has the hardware and software tools to effectively do its job. I think that the focus is about having an effective system in place, regularly updated, strong code implemented, and then deferring to the departments to sort of run them once they've got them established. It's a great question you had, though, and something I'm sure that a lot of our members across the country are thinking about when they're considering these opportunities.
Gabe, you've been incredibly helpful in unpacking this. I think with anything, though, there's typically a disconnect between intent and application. So being in Washington, D.C., you're very involved in the upstream intent side of things, right? What would you love to see in the downstream, more practical application side of things?
We spend a lot of time alerting sort of the target communities and the targeted stakeholders that these opportunities exist. And so ensuring that there is better communication between these entities that are putting out grant dollars with the intended recipients, that's a constant area where we want to see improvement. Another one is the inertia challenge of getting a grant submitted. Our departments have not been recipients of grant dollars in the way that we've seen recently. I mean, in the last 3 years, $1.5 billion invested specifically for building code, which is insane. Before then, you were seeing probably like less than $1 million a year through FEMA's program going towards code, and maybe something similar from the Department of Energy, and then some CDBG dollars for code enforcement. That was it. And so our building safety offices across the country might not have that expertise. And so having a process that's accessible for folks that are not experts is really important. And then the last piece is convincing leaders in these offices that, yes, you've got a full-time job and you're not a grant writer, but there's this historic investment that's happening, or this wave that's happening, and it's an opportunity. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity for you as a leader to take care of several years worth of training that might not have otherwise been, achievable, or do a significant upgrade. Let's say you're 3 cycles behind, you want to catch up and you want to do it in a way that recognizes your local conditions. You can do that with these resources. You could see your software upgraded so that now you've got a new system in place that's going to set you on the right track for years to come. And your department is going to be viewed as a much more agile and responsive partner in the broader construction ecosystem because of those investments. And it's seeing those things and saying, I know I've got a lot on my plate, but I'm gonna find a way to prioritize this new challenging thing so that we might capture part of this wave while it's here, because it's not like everything else, it's not going to last. I just would hate for folks to look back and look at some other departments and what they've been able to do and say, geez, I should have been part of it too. So those are the three things that we focus on at ICC is that outreach so that our members and partners are aware of the opportunities, working with our federal partners as well as our stakeholders in the field on these applications, and then doing the best we can to show success stories and to talk through the possibilities to encourage our partners and our chapters and other stakeholders to overcome that sort of inertia challenge to applying.
Well said. It's that old expression of the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago and the next best day is today. That seems to be true here as well.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, Gabe, this has been awesome, and I've learned a lot. So thanks for joining us again. But now I want to bring Stella back to close things out. Stella, we've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like I just drank water out of a fire hydrant. So can you simplify things a bit? What's the first thing someone should do if they want to apply for a grant?
Great question. First of all, here's a towel to dry yourself off from that water hose. The Code Council and myself have put together a lot of resources for our members, and we're constantly working to develop new ones as we hear what the needs are of our members. So a first great step is to check out our website. We have iccsafe.org/federal grants, and on there's a lot of resources and information about each grant program that we know about, which we can help people apply for. And it's going to tell you which program from which agency. There's a lot of different resources we've put together to help people parse through which grant is right for them and make a decision on, this is the type of project I'm looking to do. Here's a source of funding. Here's the timeline of when it's due. And we update that website whenever there might be a new grant program that comes out, or if there's new resources we've developed. We also have links on that website to previous webinars that we've hosted, or we'll promote webinars that we have coming up. And so it's a great place to just check periodically to see what you might have missed and what other additional resources you can connect with. And then you can also use the website to schedule a meeting with me, and we can have a conversation one-on-one where I can introduce you to what some of the grants are available to you, depending on what state you're in, what jurisdiction you work with. There's different ones that might be the right fit for you. And so it's a little bit of a conversation where I learn about your needs and what you're trying to do and your capabilities. And I help guide you in the right direction to learn more about what's right for your community and how to get started more tangibly in applying for that grant. That's really the hub that I always direct people to. We also have our newsletter, which if you aren't signed up for, there's a link to sign up on the website as well. And every month I send out a newsletter with any up-to-date information, usually if there's a notice of funding coming out or an upcoming event or webinar. And sometimes we share additional tips and tricks for working on a grant and how to navigate that process. The Code Council also put together last year our first ever Grant Basics for Code Officials training. And so if you're in a chapter or you help put together an education or training conference for code officials, we could come to that event and give this training. And it really walks people through not so much the project side of what ideas you could do for the grant, but just how to navigate a federal grant.
Perfect. And so ample opportunities to just further our education here. You mentioned one thing I want to circle back to. What's the best way for us to engage our newfound Stella superpower in this process? Because I love working with a human being. I need that. And so how can we engage you and just work with you throughout this process? What's the best way to do that?
The best way to get in touch with me would be to email me at federalgrants@iccsafe.org. And you can also use the Contact Me button on our Federal Grants website to schedule a meeting with me. It'll take you to a link to my calendar, and you can book a time that works for you. If you want to email me, we can set up a phone call, whatever kind of format works for you to get in touch. If you prefer to email, it's always easier once we get on the phone or a Teams meeting and kind of talk through things. You can bring in any colleagues, and we can go from there.
Awesome. I think that's what I need, certainly, and probably many others. Give me a pro tip as we conclude this episode. What are they, whoever they are, what are they looking for? What's a strong application or applicant in this process?
I would say a strong applicant is one that is clear in what their objectives are for the project, knowing exactly what you need the funding for, how you're going to use it, and explaining in your proposal how you have the means to do that. Whether it's capacity in your organization or partners that you've secured to work with you on the grant. Because the deeper you get into the process, you're going to have very clear understanding of how every dollar is going to be spent. And so the sooner you can get clear on what it is that you want to do and how you're going to get there over the next 2 to 5 years, depending on the term of the grant, will really stand out, and making sure that you're aligning really with the objectives of each program, because every program, everybody has their own motivation. Every source of funding has their motivation. And so making sure that whatever the priorities of that goal are, whether it be energy efficiency and reaching net zero, or if it's resiliency and disaster mitigation, how are the building code and energy code projects you're going to do really meet those bottom lines and benefit your community at the end of the day.
Awesome. We're in the bonus round now, so stay with me. I got one last question for you. This is a tradition we're going to carry into season 6. It began earlier, but the final question, I know you know what's coming. What is your favorite building and why?
I don't know if there is a particular building that comes to mind, but I will say, I live in New York City, so it's really an adventure every day that I walk outside the streets of this city that has a lot of history as well as a lot of modernization. I grew up in the Southwest where the buildings were fairly new and fairly similar. No offense to mass home builders, but nothing too exciting with the architecture in a lot of those. And so getting to live on the East Coast where there is so much history in the architecture and a lot of innovation with new skyscrapers, it's really something I love to do and just look up and take in the old detail on buildings that we unfortunately don't see a lot in newer buildings, as well as the creative, futuristic style of new buildings, and not just taking them in from the outside, but even getting to go inside and appreciate those. I don't have a number one, but I definitely am an admirer of architecture and try to pay attention wherever I travel. Now I'm going to go ponder what my favorite buildings in the world.
Yeah, shoot me an email and let me know.
Sounds good.
I hope you got as much out of that episode as I did. Again, this is relatively new territory for me. So as we think about improving building safety in our community, it's going to be an ongoing effort, but federal funding is there to help. And more importantly, folks like Stella are there to help secure it. Stella Carr really is your one-stop shop for all things grant related. She is the Code Council's gift to you, and it is an invaluable resource. So I encourage everyone to reach out to her. The best way to do that is to go to iccsafe.org/federal grants or email federalgrants@iccsafe.org. Special thanks to Landmark Media for editing this season of the ICC Pulse Podcast. Hey, you're not going to want to miss our next episode where we dive into the world of AI and what tools are becoming available to all of us. It's going to be a fun one. But remember this, in these knowledge-driven conversations that we get to have every single day, people don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. So let's be quick to listen, slow to speak, and we'll meet you back here next time on the ICC Pulse Podcast.